A sterile mobster married a pregnant waitress, so she would give him an heir. Years later, the waitress shocked everyone by revealing that so she would give him an heir. Each like and comment helps Heart Pulses touch even more hearts. Join us for the next story. The damp cloth slowly slid across the surface of the synthetic marble table as Isabella tried to ignore the back pain that intensified with each movement. At 7 months pregnant, every task seemed like a monumental challenge, but she needed the job at the coffee shop more than ever. Bills were piling up at home, and the silence of her phone only confirmed what she already knew. She was completely alone on this journey. The sound of the doorbell made her look up, and her heart sank when she recognized the figure who had just entered. "It can't be him," she whispered to herself, her hands trembling imperceptibly. Anthony Costa appeared at the coffee shop door like an unexpected storm, his perfectly aligned hair contrasting with the red eyes of someone who had been drinking too much. Behind him, 2 men in expensive suits laughed loudly, clearly enjoying what they considered evening entertainment. Isabella felt the air escape from her lungs when his eyes met hers, a mixture of contempt and something that seemed almost like disgust. For 7 months she had imagined this moment, rehearsed the words she would say, but now her mind was completely blank. "Anthony," was all she managed to mutter, her voice coming out weaker than intended. The other customers in the coffee shop seemed to sense the tension in the air, unconsciously lowering the tone of their conversations while watching the scene unfold. Anthony advanced toward her with determined steps, completely ignoring the curious glances around him. Isabella instinctively placed her hand over her belly, a protective gesture that had become automatic over the months. The smell of his expensive perfume, which once gave her butterflies in her stomach, now only intensified the nausea she already felt. "So this is where you've been hiding after trying to blackmail me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Humiliation hit Isabella like a physical slap, making her cheeks burn with shame. She could feel all eyes fixed on her, judging, speculating, creating their own versions of the story unfolding before them. Anthony seemed to be delighting in her discomfort. His lips curved into a cruel smile she had never seen before. His friends chuckled softly, as if watching a private show. "Please, not here," she begged, her voice almost inaudible. "You know very well I never tried to blackmail you." "It's not my child," Anthony suddenly shouted, pointing at her belly with a theatrical gesture that made several customers turn completely toward them. "This waitress is trying to trick me, pretending the child is mine just because I have money." The words left his mouth like poison, each syllable intended to destroy any dignity Isabella might still have. She felt her legs weaken, needing to lean on the table to avoid falling. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of a cup being roughly placed on a saucer. "You know that's not true," she managed to say, tears beginning to blur her vision. The coffee shop owner, a middle-aged man who had always been kind to Isabella, appeared as if from nowhere beside them. His face was red with embarrassment and indignation, alternating his gaze between Isabella and Anthony, with an obvious expression of discomfort. Isabella could see in his eyes that he had already made his decision, even before the words left his mouth. The reputation of his small business was at stake, and she knew there would be no way to reverse what was about to happen. "Isabella, I think you better leave," he said quietly, avoiding looking directly at her. "I can't have this kind of situation here." The boss's words were like the final blow in a battle she had already lost before it even began. Isabella felt something die inside her chest, a part of her dignity that she might never recover. She removed her apron with trembling hands, each movement seeming to happen in slow motion. Anthony remained there, observing her destruction with a satisfaction that bordered on sadistic, while his friends whispered among themselves as if commenting on a movie. "At least now everyone knows what kind of person you really are," she said, surprising herself with the firmness she found in her voice. The walk to the exit seemed to last an eternity, with Isabella feeling each pair of eyes following her movements. Her savings were insufficient for more than a week, and now, without a job and with a destroyed reputation, options seemed to have completely disappeared. The cold of the night hit her like a shock, making her realize that she had left without getting her coat from inside the staff locker. The tears finally began to flow freely down her face, carrying with them months of repressed hope and shattered dreams. How did it come to this? She wondered, embracing her belly as if she could protect her baby from all the cruelty of the world. The street was busier than usual for such a late hour, with cars passing hastily and people walking without paying attention to the personal drama that had just unfolded. Isabella stood still on the sidewalk, not knowing where to go or what to do, feeling more lost than ever in her life. The rented apartment she shared with a roommate was miles away, and she didn't even have money for a bus fare. The feeling of being completely alone in the world had never been so intense, weighing on her shoulders like an impossible burden to carry. "My baby doesn't deserve this," she whispered to the cold night, like a promise she didn't know how to keep. It was then that the deep sound of an engine caught her attention, making her raise her eyes from the tears that stained the ground. A black limousine slid to a stop right in front of her, its dark windows reflecting the city lights like mystical mirrors. The vehicle was impeccable, emanating an aura of power and wealth that contrasted drastically with her current situation. Isabella was paralyzed, observing the car as if it were an apparition, unable to process what was happening. For a moment, she thought that perhaps it was some mistake, that the driver would realize the error and move on, leaving her alone again with her problems. The rear door opened with a soft and discreet noise, and 3 men emerged from the luxurious interior like figures from a movie. All wore impeccable suits that cost more than Isabella earned in a year, their posture radiating a confidence she had never seen before. The tallest of the 3 had graying hair at the temples and almost imperceptible scars on his face, while the other 2 seemed younger, but equally intimidating. Isabella instinctively took a step back, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice coming out more like a frightened whisper. The most elegant man of the 3 approached with measured steps, his penetrating gaze studying every detail of Isabella's face with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed. There was something in his eyes that suggested he knew much more about her than he should, as if he had access to secrets that not even she knew. When he finally spoke, his voice had a deep and controlled timbre that commanded immediate attention. The accent carried traces of a refined education, but also a hardness that indicated experience, with situations much less civilized than that one. "Miss Carter," he said, pronouncing her name as if it were something precious and fragile. Isabella felt a shiver run down her spine when she heard her surname being pronounced by a complete stranger. How did he know who she was? How long had they been watching her? The questions multiplied in her mind, but she was too paralyzed to verbalize them. The man continued to observe her with those calculating eyes, as if he were evaluating her reaction to every word. The other 2 remained silent, but Isabella could feel their presence as an almost tangible force around her. "My employer wants to talk to you," he continued, gesturing elegantly toward the open limousine. The offer hung in the air between them, like a suspended bridge over an unknown abyss, and Isabella instinctively knew that accepting would mean crossing a line from which there might be no return. She looked alternately at the elegant man and the luxurious interior of the car, where she could glimpse leather seats that probably cost more than everything she owned. Her desperate situation contrasted drastically with the mysterious opportunity that presented itself before her. There was nothing more to lose, no obvious alternative, no other door to run to. With her hand still protecting her belly, she took the first step toward the car, whispering a question she knew would not get an answer. "What does he want with me?" The man smiled for the first time, an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes but that carried an indefinite promise that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. "That, Miss Carter, is something only he can answer," he said, extending his hand to help her into the vehicle. Isabella hesitated for only a second, looking one last time at the coffee shop where she had lost everything, before accepting the offered hand. When she settled into the luxurious seat, a single certainty echoed in her mind as the door closed silently behind her. "There's no turning back after this." The computer screen reflected the cold glow of the office lights, while Alexander Romano maintained his impenetrable expression before the tense faces observing him through the video conference. Each man in the meeting commanded vast territories and armies of loyalty, but at that moment, all seemed small before the magnitude of what was being discussed. The Italian leather chair where he sat had belonged to his father and before him to his grandfather, creating a lineage of power that few dared to challenge. The heavy silence that hung over the conversation carried decades of tradition and expectations that weighed on his shoulders like an invisible armor. Succession cannot wait forever, he thought, discreetly clenching his fist under the mahogany table. Vincent Greco, a 60-year-old man whose scars told stories of battles won and territories conquered, leaned toward the camera with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His voice carried the weight of decades of experience, but also a subtle provocation that Alexander immediately recognized. The other bosses remained silent, observing the dynamics between the two most powerful men in the organization. It was a dangerous game Vincent was playing, publicly questioning Alexander's leadership capacity. "To be capo di tutti capi, Alexander, you need an heir," he said, each word loaded with challenge. "Tradition demands family continuity." The words hit Alexander like sharp blades, cutting through his armor carefully built over the years. He had anticipated this conversation, prepared for it, but hearing it verbalized before the other leaders still caused a deep pain in his chest. His fingers contracted imperceptibly under the table, the only physical manifestation of the storm raging within him. The other men on the screen watched him with a mixture of curiosity and expectation, some clearly savoring the moment of vulnerability. "Vincent is right," murmured another boss, his voice barely disguising his satisfaction. "Without descendants, how can we guarantee the stability of our organization?" The pressure in Alexander's chest intensified, but his expression remained as firm as marble sculpted by Renaissance masters. Decades of training in controlling his emotions allowed him to face storms like this, without showing weakness before his subordinates. He knew that any sign of insecurity would be interpreted as incompetence, fueling the ambitions of those who questioned his authority. The Romano family legacy could not be tarnished by his inability to produce an heir, not when he was so close to achieving absolute power. "Traditions exist for a reason," he finally responded, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And I will honor all of them at the appropriate time." Michael Lombardi, the youngest of the bosses present, dared to smile openly, clearly interpreting Alexander's response as evasive. His youth made him reckless, and Alexander made a mental note to deal with this insubordination later. The eyes of the other leaders gleamed with a mixture of speculation and opportunism, like predators sensing weakness in their prey. The organization's hierarchy was maintained through respect and fear, and public questions about his suitability as supreme leader could destabilize everything he had built. "Time is a luxury our position does not allow," said Matthew, his voice laden with dangerous insinuations. "Others may not have the patience to wait indefinitely." Alexander felt the familiar burning of anger rise in his throat, but forced himself to maintain the composure he had perfected over 2 decades in command. Matthew's veiled threat did not go unnoticed, and he mentally filed away every word for future consideration. This was how internal coups began, with whispers and insinuations that gradually undermined established authority. But he had a plan, a solution that none of them could anticipate, something that would completely change the power dynamic between them. "Patience," he said slowly, allowing each syllable to carry the weight of his authority, "is a virtue that separates leaders from pretenders." The tension in the video conference became almost palpable, with each man processing the implications of Alexander's carefully chosen words. Vincent narrowed his eyes, clearly recognizing the warning contained in the response, while Michael seemed to be reconsidering his strategy of direct confrontation. The other chiefs remained silent, preferring to observe the psychological battle between the 3 most powerful men in the organization. Alexander knew he had skillfully navigated through the treacherous waters of internal politics, but he also understood that this was only a temporary truce. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a sword, "I believe we all have more pressing matters to resolve in our own territories." One by one, the faces disappeared from the screen until Alexander was alone in his office, silence replacing the hostile murmur of the meeting. The pressure he had been containing throughout the conversation finally found an outlet, manifesting in a clenched fist that he slammed once on the mahogany desk. The sound echoed through the office like a silent scream of frustration and determination. He rose from his chair and walked to the panoramic window that offered a complete view of his domains, lands that extended as far as the eye could see. "They don't know what's coming," he muttered to himself, his words carrying a dark promise. The ancestral portrait of the Romano family dominated the opposite wall, a tapestry of solemn faces that had ruled with an iron fist throughout generations. Alexander walked until he stood before the painting, studying the penetrating eyes of his great-grandfather, the man who had established the empire he now commanded. Each face in the portrait represented not just a person, but an era of power and influence that had been carefully built and maintained through centuries. The responsibility of continuing this lineage weighed on him like an invisible chain, constantly reminding him that he was not just an individual, but the guardian of a legacy. "They had children," he whispered to the silent faces. "I will find a way." The office door opened silently, and Marcus Brunoro entered with the discretion that characterized his 20 years of loyal service to the Romano family. His face, marked by a unique scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, remained impassive as he awaited instructions. Marcus had witnessed more family secrets than any man should carry, and his unwavering loyalty made him more valuable than any other member of the organization. Alexander didn't need to turn to recognize the presence of his right-hand man, the atmosphere of the office subtly changing with his arrival. "The news is good, I hope," said Alexander, still observing the ancestral portrait. Marcus approached with measured steps, stopping at a respectful distance before speaking. His voice carried the authority of someone who had executed impossible orders and guarded deadly secrets throughout decades of service. Alexander finally turned to face him, immediately noticing the contained satisfaction in the eyes of his most trusted subordinate. It was an expression he had learned to recognize over the years, indicating that a delicate operation had been successfully completed. "The waitress has arrived, Don Alexander," Marcus said, pronouncing the words with the precision of a surgeon. "She is waiting in the hall exactly as you ordered." A wave of satisfaction ran through Alexander's body, the first genuinely positive emotion he had experienced in weeks. The plan that had been meticulously elaborated over months was finally materializing, each piece fitting into its designated place. He adjusted the cuffs of his Italian silk shirt, an automatic gesture that indicated his mental transition from strategist to executor. The pregnant waitress represented more than a solution to his personal problems. She was the key to definitively silencing the voices that questioned his suitability as supreme leader. "Perfect," he said, allowing an almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. "Bring her to the main hall." Marcus nodded and headed for the door, but stopped when Alexander called his name again. The tension in the air subtly changed, charging with an energy that Marcus recognized as the harbinger of particularly important instructions. Alexander rarely repeated orders or added last-minute details, so when he did, it usually meant that something fundamental was about to happen. "Marcus," Alexander said, his voice assuming a tone that admitted no questions, "make sure she feels welcome. This conversation will determine the future of all of us." With Marcus out of the office, Alexander was alone with his thoughts and the magnitude of what was about to happen. He walked to the ornate mirror that dominated a side wall, adjusting his silk tie and smoothing his dark hair that showed the first silver threads at the temples. The reflected image showed a man at the height of his power, each line of his face sculpted by responsibility and authority. But behind the dark eyes there was a vulnerability that he had learned to hide from the world, a wound that had never completely healed. "She cannot know," he murmured to his reflection. "She can never know the truth about my inability." Alexander left the office and began walking down the marble corridor that led to the main hall, each step echoing through the high arches like a ceremonial march. The paintings on the walls documented centuries of family history, proud faces that had built an empire through strength, intelligence, and relentless determination. His Italian leather shoes produced a steady rhythm against the marble, a percussion that marked his approach to the meeting that would change everything. The pregnant woman waiting for him had no idea of the storm she had unleashed simply by existing at the right moment. "She will be my salvation," he thought, "or my downfall." The main hall of the Romano mansion stretched before Isabella like a scene from an impossible dream, with high ceilings adorned with Renaissance frescoes and an Italian marble fireplace that crackled softly. She was sunk into the cognac-colored leather sofa, her nervous fingers unconsciously tracing the intricate patterns of the fabric as she tried to process the reality of where she found herself. The contrast between her desperate situation from hours ago and the opulent luxury that now surrounded her seemed surreal, as if she had crossed a portal to another world. The flames from the fireplace danced hypnotically, creating shadows that played on walls lined with ancient books and artwork that probably cost more than she would earn in several lifetimes. "How is it possible that I am here?" she thought, instinctively protecting her belly with both hands. The sound of firm footsteps echoing through the marble corridor made Isabella raise her head, her heart racing with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity about who the mysterious patron who had ordered her presence might be. Each beat resounded like a drum announcing the arrival of something monumentally important, making her unconsciously adjust her posture on the sofa. She could feel a change in the atmosphere of the hall, as if the air itself was charging with a powerful and intimidating energy that made her feel small and vulnerable. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the simple dress she wore, a modest piece that seemed even more inadequate surrounded by such luxury. "He must be someone very important," she whispered to herself, trying to gather courage to face the unknown. The double mahogany door opened silently, and Alexander Romano entered the hall with a presence that immediately commanded all attention in the room. His movements were calculated and fluid, each step a demonstration of absolute confidence and unquestionable power. The tailored Italian wool suit perfectly molded his imposing silhouette, while his dark eyes scanned the hall before fixing intensely on Isabella. She felt the air escape from her lungs when their gazes met, an electric current running down her spine with an intensity that left her momentarily paralyzed. "Miss Carter," he said, his deep voice reverberating through the hall like a royal command. "I hope you are being well treated." Isabella tried to rise from the sofa, but Alexander raised an elegant hand, signaling for her to remain seated as he walked toward her with measured steps. There was something predatory in his movements, like a powerful feline studying its prey, but also a calculated gentleness that confused her. She observed every detail of his appearance, from the dark hair combed back with military precision to the silk tie that perfectly matched the shine of his leather shoes. His age seemed to be in his early 30s, but his eyes carried a maturity that suggested experiences well beyond his chronological age. I don't understand why I'm here," she managed to say, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. "Who are you?" Alexander stopped a few meters away, positioning himself so that the light from the fireplace created a golden halo around his silhouette, making him even more imposing and mysterious. His dark eyes studied every detail of Isabella's face, from the dried tears that still stained her cheeks to the defensive posture she had adopted to protect her belly. There was something in her vulnerability that awakened emotions he had buried deeply, a tenderness that contrasted drastically with the coldness that normally characterized his interactions. "My name is Alexander Romano," he finally said, allowing the weight of his identity to settle in the air between them. "And you, Miss Carter, may be the solution to a problem we have in common." The Romano name echoed in Isabella's mind like an alarm bell, carrying with it whispers of power and danger that she had heard even in her simple world of coffee shops and modest apartments. Everyone knew the stories, the whispered rumors about the family that controlled entire territories, with a combination of respect and fear. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she processed the reality of being alone with a man whose reputation preceded any formal introduction. Alexander observed the change in her expression, noting how her eyes widened slightly with recognition and a hint of fear. "You don't need to be afraid," he said softly, though his voice still carried an authority that brooked no questioning. "If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't have taken the care to bring you here." Alexander walked to the fireplace, positioning himself with his back to the flames, creating a dramatic silhouette that completely dominated the ambience of the hall. His hands were crossed behind his back, a posture that simultaneously revealed relaxation and absolute control of the situation. Isabella observed every movement with fascination, mixed with apprehension, unable to look away from the imposing figure who seemed to have stepped directly out of a film about power and influence. There was a natural elegance in his gestures that suggested years of refined education and immeasurable responsibilities. "I have a proposal for you," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "One that can solve both our problems permanently." Isabella felt her heart race even faster, if that were possible, as she tried to decipher the intentions behind Alexander's carefully chosen words. The way he spoke carried promises and threats in equal measure, leaving her simultaneously curious and terrified about what he might be proposing. Her maternal instincts made her want to protect the baby she carried, even if it meant accepting help from a man whose reputation was built on dangerous foundations. "What kind of proposal?" she asked, surprising herself with the firmness she found in her own voice. Alexander smiled for the first time since entering the hall, an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes, but carried an indefinite promise. "One that will change your life forever," he replied, "if you're willing to listen." The tension in the hall became almost palpable when Alexander began to move again, walking slowly toward the sofa where Isabella remained motionless. Each step seemed calculated to create maximum psychological impact, demonstrating his absolute control over the situation and over her emotions. Isabella could feel the magnetism emanating from him like an almost physical force, pulling her into an orbit of influence from which she intuited it would be difficult to escape. When he finally stopped before her, their presences occupied the entire space of the hall, making irrelevant any other element of the luxurious environment. "I need to be direct with you," he said, his voice assuming a more intimate tone that made Isabella's heart skip a beat. "I am sterile." The words hit Isabella like an unexpected lightning bolt, making her blink several times as she tried to process the brutal confession Alexander had just made. The vulnerability contained in this admission contrasted drastically with the aura of invincible power he projected, revealing a humanity she didn't expect to find. There was pain in his eyes, an old wound he had learned to hide from the world but now exposed before a pregnant and desperate stranger. Isabella felt something inside her chest soften slightly, recognizing the courage needed to admit such a weakness to someone he barely knew. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to continue. "Because you are pregnant, and I need an heir." The reality of the proposal began to form in Isabella's mind, like pieces of a dark puzzle slowly fitting together. She could see where the conversation was heading, and the magnitude of the implications left her simultaneously fascinated and terrified. Alexander observed the emotions passing across her face, like waves in the ocean, each expression revealing her internal thoughts with crystal clarity. There was intelligence in her eyes, a quick understanding of the situation that he admired and respected. "I need an heir for my position in the family," he continued, his voice assuming the tone of a businessman presenting a contract. "You need protection and security for your child." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the air between them. "We can solve each other's problems." Isabella felt a wave of indignation rise up her throat, mixing with the vulnerability and fear she already carried. The proposal, however logical it might seem on the surface, reduced her humanity to a reproductive function, transforming her into a piece in a power game she barely understood. Her fists clenched involuntarily as she found a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am not an object for negotiation," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the hall with a determination that surprised them both. Alexander studied her reaction with renewed interest, as if her resistance only made her more intriguing in his eyes. "You are talking about me as if I were merchandise to be bought and sold." Alexander stepped forward, drastically reducing the distance between them, his presence becoming even more dominant and magnetic. The movement was calculated to intimidate, but Isabella noticed something else in his eyes, an intensity that went beyond simple commercial negotiation. "You are not an object," he said, his voice lowering to an almost hypnotic tone. "You are the solution we both need." His eyes fixed on hers, with an intensity that momentarily made her forget to breathe, as if he were trying to convey something that words couldn't express. The air between them crackled with an energy that Isabella couldn't identify, but that made her feel simultaneously threatened and protected. Look around you, he continued, gesturing elegantly to the luxury that surrounded them. This could be your life. During the conversation, Alexander noticed how Isabella instinctively placed her hands over her belly every time she felt threatened or nervous, a protective gesture that awakened something unexpected and profound in his chest. There was a maternal purity in her movements that contrasted with the cynicism that dominated his world, touching emotions he had buried years ago. Each time she made this gesture, he felt a strange pang, a mixture of envy and admiration for her ability to create life when he was unable to do so. Mansion, security, luxury, he enumerated, his voice taking on an almost seductive tone. Your child will grow up with all the advantages that money can provide. He observed how her eyes momentarily sparkled with possibility before resistance returned. All you need to do is accept my surname. Isabella felt divided between the tempting offer and her own principles, her heart beating so hard that she was sure Alexander could hear it. The life he described contrasted drastically with the grim reality that awaited her if she refused, but accepting would mean giving up her autonomy and dignity. Her eyes scanned the luxurious hall, imagining what it would be like to raise her child in such an environment, surrounded by opportunities she could never provide alone. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly with the courage needed to ask such a question. Alexander tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response, but there was something predatory in his eyes that suggested refusal wasn't really an option. "That's an interesting question," he murmured. Alexander took another step forward, completely invading Isabella's personal space, his proximity making the air between them seem electrified and charged with a tension she had never experienced before. She could feel the heat emanating from his body, the subtle aroma of his masculine perfume, mixing with something more primitive and dangerous. His dark eyes seemed capable of reading every thought that passed through her mind, every doubt and fear she tried to hide. "You won't refuse," he said, his voice low and controlled, but loaded with an absolute certainty that made her tremble. His proximity was overwhelming, creating a magnetic field from which she seemed unable to escape. "Because you know this is your only chance to give your child the life he deserves." The sexual tension that had been silently building throughout the conversation suddenly exploded, when Alexander, moved by an impulse that even he didn't completely understand, leaned in and captured Isabella's lips with his own. The kiss was possessive and intense, loaded with months of frustration and repressed desire that found an unexpected outlet in that moment. Isabella was paralyzed for a second, her brain trying to process the reality of what was happening, before something deep inside her responded to his touch with an intensity that surprised her. Their bodies seemed to fit perfectly together, like pieces of a puzzle that finally found their correct places. "What are we doing?" she thought, even as she felt herself melting in his arms. When they finally parted, both were breathless, their breaths mingling in the air charged with tension and unresolved desire that hung between them. Alexander kept his face close to hers, his dark eyes shining with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed and vulnerable. Isabella could feel her legs weakening, her body betraying the resistance that her mind was trying to maintain against his proposal. The kiss had changed something fundamental between them, creating a connection that transcended the cold business transaction he had initially proposed. "You stay," Alexander whispered in her ear, his husky voice carrying a promise and a threat in equal parts. "It's not a question." Isabella closed her eyes, knowing that he wouldn't let her leave even if she wanted to, and realizing with a shock that perhaps she didn't want to leave anyway. Isabella's room in the Romano mansion had become her refuge and her prison throughout the 2 years that had passed since that fateful night in the main hall. The damask silk walls that once seemed luxurious now witnessed her silent tears, each golden thread reflecting the melancholy that had settled in her soul. Matthew slept peacefully in his Italian mahogany crib, his dark hair spread against the satin pillow, oblivious to the emotional storm that ravaged his mother every night. Isabella observed the boy who had grown up calling Alexander father, her heart breaking at the thought of how the cold agreement had transformed into something much more complex and painful. 2 years and I still feel like I'm walking a tightrope," she whispered to the darkness. Alexander had achieved exactly what he wanted with Matthew's arrival, triumphantly ascending to the position of capo di tutti capi before an organization that finally recognized his ability to lead and perpetuate the family lineage. The other families accepted his authority without question, impressed by the apparently robust heir he had presented to the world with convincing paternal pride. But professional success had cost a price he hadn't anticipated, creating an emotional distance between him and Isabella that grew each day like an insurmountable abyss. The man who had once kissed her with desperate passion now treated her with an icy courtesy that cut deeper than any open cruelty. The agreement has been fulfilled, he constantly reminded himself. There should be nothing more beyond that. The daily routine in the mansion had been established with the precision of a Swiss clock mechanism. Each interaction between Alexander and Isabella carefully orchestrated to maintain the emotional distance he considered necessary. He would appear for breakfast at exactly 7 o'clock, greet Isabella with a polite nod, briefly play with Matthew to keep up appearances in front of the staff, and then disappear into his office or business-related commitments. Isabella had learned to interpret each gesture, each fleeting glance, each measured word as signs of an internal war he waged with himself. "Good morning, Isabella," he would say with the same formal intonation he would use with any business associate. "I hope you rested well." The nights were particularly difficult for Isabella, when the silence of the mansion amplified every sound and every unresolved thought that lingered between the ornate walls. She would stay awake for hours, listening to Alexander's footsteps echoing down the hallway, when he finally returned from his nightly commitments, always briefly stopping in front of her door before continuing to his own quarters. There were nights when she could swear she had heard him hesitate on the other side of the door, as if fighting against the impulse to knock and break the silence that had settled between them. But the courage to open the door and confront her own feelings always abandoned her at the last moment. "He sees me only as the mother of his heir," she thought bitterly. "Nothing beyond a function that has been fulfilled." Alexander, for his part, waged an epic battle with himself every time he passed Isabella's room, his fists involuntarily clenching as he fought against the devastating desire to break the barriers he himself had built. The feelings he had developed for her over those 2 years had grown like a wild plant that refused to be controlled or eradicated, blooming in the most unexpected moments and threatening to destroy the composure he had cultivated for decades. Each smile she directed at Matthew, each maternal gesture she observed from a distance, each rare occasion when their gazes accidentally met during meals, fueled a fire that he desperately tried to extinguish. She fulfilled her part of the agreement, he forced himself to remember. Anything beyond that is a complication I cannot allow myself. The storm forming outside the mansion seemed to perfectly mirror the emotional turbulence boiling inside the two protagonists of this denied love story. The winds howled through the meticulously maintained gardens, making the windows vibrate, with an intensity that left Isabella particularly nervous on that specific night. Matthew had woken up twice due to the thunder, and she was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the combination of physical tiredness and emotional exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Alexander was traveling on business, or at least that's what Marcus had informed during dinner, leaving her alone with her thoughts and fears. "Even the storms seem more intense when he's not here," she admitted to herself. "How is that possible if he barely speaks to me?" The sound of shattering glass on the ground floor of the mansion made Isabella freeze in her nursing chair, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and confusion about what might be happening. Matthew immediately woke up with the noise, starting to cry with the intensity that only 2-year-old children can achieve when frightened. Isabella picked him up, trying to calm him while silently walking to the bedroom door, pressing her ear against the wood in an attempt to decipher the sounds coming from below. Heavy and uncontrolled footsteps echoed through the marble corridors, accompanied by a voice that she recognized with growing horror. "It can't be him," she whispered, pressing Matthew against her chest. "How did he find out where I live?" Anthony Costa appeared at Isabella's bedroom door like an apparition from her worst nightmares, his disheveled hair and wrinkled clothes revealing hours of drinking and destructive determination. His red eyes shone with a toxic mixture of alcohol and possessiveness that made Isabella instinctively retreat toward the window. He had changed drastically in the 2 years since their last encounter at the coffee shop. His face thinner, and marked by lines that suggested a life of excesses and regrets. The way he filled the doorway, blocking any possibility of escape, made Isabella's heart beat so hard that she was sure he could hear every beat. "I've come to get my family," he shouted, pointing with a trembling finger at Matthew. "That child is mine." Isabella tried to maintain her composure, even when every maternal instinct screamed for her to protect Matthew from the storm of fury and instability that Anthony had brought into their sanctuary. She positioned herself so that her body was between the drunk man and the child, using her own form as a human shield against the threat that had materialized before them. "You have no right to be here," she managed to say, her voice trembling only slightly despite the terror running through her veins. "You abandoned us, remember? Said he wasn't your son." Anthony laughed with a bitterness that cut through the air like a rusty blade. 2 years thinking about it made me realize I made a mistake," he said, staggering slightly. "Now, I've come to make things right." Anthony's approach was predatory and desperate at the same time, each step revealing the instability of a man who had made an impulsive decision fueled by alcohol and belated regret. Isabella could smell the whiskey on his breath even from a distance, mixed with something darker that suggested weeks of self-destruction and growing obsession. When he extended his arms toward Matthew, who was crying inconsolably against his mother's shoulder, Isabella backed up until her back touched the cold wall, realizing she had cornered herself with no possible escape. "Please, you're scaring him," she begged, trying to appeal to any trace of humanity that still existed in the man she once knew. "He doesn't know you, Anthony." "He will know me," Anthony growled. "We're family, and families stay together." Anthony grabbed Isabella's arm with a force that made her moan in pain, his fingers digging into her delicate skin as he tried to pull her toward the bedroom door. Matthew intensified his crying, clearly perceiving the danger even at his tender age, his small fists desperately clinging to his mother's clothes. "You're coming with me now," Anthony shouted, his voice echoing through the luxurious room like a blasphemy against the peace that had once existed there. Isabella fought against his grip, trying to free herself without dropping Matthew, but the combination of panic and the awkward position made her resistance ineffective. "Let me go," she shouted, her voice carrying all the pain and despair that had accumulated over the past 2 years. "Alessandro." Alexander's name echoed through the mansion like a war cry and desperate plea combined, reverberating through the marble corridors and reaching every corner of the property with an intensity that cut through the storm outside. Isabella screamed with a strength she didn't know she possessed, channeling 2 years of repressed frustrations and unrequited love into a single appeal for salvation. Anthony continued to drag her toward the door, completely ignoring Matthew's cries and her pleas, determined to execute his unbalanced plan to reunite a family that had never really existed. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the corridors, each beat carrying the promise that help was coming. "He will hear me," Isabella thought desperately. "He has to hear me." Alexander Romano appeared at the bedroom door, like an unleashed force of nature, his dark eyes blazing with a fury that completely transformed his usually controlled expression. He had returned early from his trip and had just entered the mansion when he heard Isabella's scream echoing through his house, a sound that activated protective instincts he didn't even know he possessed. The sight of Anthony trying to drag Isabella and Matthew out of the room detonated something primitive and devastating in his chest, a possessiveness that swept away all the emotional walls he had built over the past 2 years. His presence completely filled the doorway, radiating a lethal authority that made the air in the room feel electrified. "What is happening here?" His voice cut through the chaos like an ice blade. The transformation in Alexander was instantaneous and terrifying to observe, like watching a supreme predator recognize a threat to its territory. All years of training in emotional control evaporated in the face of seeing Isabella being forcibly touched by another man, especially the man who had abandoned her when she most needed protection. His muscles visibly tensed under the perfectly tailored suit, every fiber of his being preparing for a battle that had been inevitable from the moment Anthony set foot on his property. The jealousy he had denied and repressed for 2 long years exploded with the force of a nuclear bomb, sweeping away any pretense that his feelings for Isabella were merely professional. "Take your hands off her," he said, his voice low but loaded with a deadly threat. Now, Anthony, even in his alcohol-altered state, immediately recognized the danger Alexander represented, but his obsession and desperation prevented him from backing away as his self-preservation instinct demanded. He tightened his grip on Isabella's arm, using her almost as a human shield as he confronted the man who had taken his family. "This is my son!" he shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "She is my wife! You have no right to keep them here!" Alexander took a step into the room, each movement calculated and predatory, like a feline preparing to attack its prey. The intensity of his presence made Anthony involuntarily step back, dragging Isabella with him. "Your wife?" Alexander repeated, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Where were you when she needed you?" Alexander moved quickly, confronting Anthony in a way that forced him to release Isabella instantly. His intimidating presence made it clear that any resistance would have serious consequences. "Take your hands off her," he said, each word pronounced with an icy clarity that made Anthony tremble with genuine fear. Isabella fell to her knees, still holding Matthew, watching with fascination and terror as Alexander demonstrated a side of his personality she had never seen before. The fury in his eyes burned with an intensity that could incinerate everything around. But when he quickly looked at her, there was also a protective tenderness that made her heart skip. "You don't touch her," Alexander continued, his voice taking on a tone that promised devastating consequences. "Ever again." Alexander pulled Isabella into his arms with a gentleness that drastically contrasted with the contained violence he had demonstrated seconds before, enveloping her and Matthew in a protective embrace that communicated more than 1,000 words could express. The boy gradually stopped crying, recognizing the safety that Alexander's presence always represented, his little arms automatically extending toward the man he knew as father. Isabella felt herself melting against Alexander's strong chest, 2 years of emotional distance, evaporating in the heat of his protective proximity like morning mist before the rising sun. The transformation in him was palpable, as if the threat to his family had definitively broken the barriers he had built around his own heart. "They're safe," he murmured against her hair, his voice hoarse with repressed emotion, each word carrying a promise that transcended any marital vow or business agreement they had made in the past. "I would never let anyone hurt them. I will never again allow them to feel vulnerable or unprotected." His arms tightened around them with an intensity that revealed years of contained feelings finally finding their expression, as if he were trying to absorb all the pain and fear they had experienced and replace them with his unwavering strength. Anthony, still reeling from the encounter with Alexander's fury, observed the scene with a mixture of defeat and belated understanding that he had lost any right he might have claimed over Isabella and Matthew, realizing that he was witnessing a love that he had never been capable of offering or understanding. The first rays of morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the master bedroom in the Romano mansion, creating golden patterns that danced across Isabella's serene face as she slept nestled against Alexander's strong chest. 6 months had passed since that stormy night that changed everything between them. 6 months of emotional and physical discoveries that transformed a cold business arrangement into the most intense love story either of them had ever experienced. Alexander slept with a protective arm wrapped around her waist, even in sleep keeping her secure against his body, as if he feared she might disappear if he relaxed his vigilance for even a moment. "I never imagined I could feel so complete," thought Isabella, watching the first lights of day illuminate the relaxed features of the man who had become her entire world. The nausea hit Isabella like a sudden, overwhelming wave, making her rise abruptly in bed, with a hand pressed against her lips in a desperate attempt to contain the sickness rising up her throat. Alexander woke immediately, his protective instincts activated by her sudden movement, his dark eyes instantly alert and concerned. He observed her for a second, processing the signals her body was sending, before a shocking understanding began to form in his mind. "Isabella," he said softly, sitting up in bed and extending a careful hand toward her. "Are you all right?" But even as he asked the question, he knew that the answer could change everything again. Alexander acted with an efficiency that contrasted with the turmoil of emotions bubbling inside him. Rising from the bed and carrying Isabella in his arms to the bathroom before she could protest. He gently held her hair back while she bent over the toilet, his free hand tracing comforting circles on her back, while whispering words of comfort in Italian. The intimacy of the moment transcended any physical or emotional barrier that might still exist between them, revealing a tenderness that Alexander rarely allowed others to see. "Breathe deeply," he murmured, his voice laden with a concern that went far beyond superficial care. "I'm here with you." Isabella closed her eyes, trying to focus on the comforting sensation of his hands instead of the confusion growing in her mind. When Isabella finally managed to compose herself, Alexander helped her sit on the edge of the marble bathtub, kneeling before her with an expression that mixed deep concern with something she couldn't completely identify. His dark eyes scanned her face, looking for signs of illness or discomfort, but there was also a cautious hope in his expression that made Isabella's heart race for reasons completely different from the nausea. "How long have you been feeling like this?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an underlying tension. Isabella considered the question for a moment, remembering other episodes of morning sickness that she had attributed to stress or changes in diet. "A few days," she admitted hesitantly, "but I didn't think it was. Do you think it could be?" The possibility hung in the air between them, like a suspended bridge over an abyss of medical impossibility, each processing the implications differently but with equal intensity. Alexander felt his heart race with a desperate mixture of hope and absolute terror, remembering the decades of acceptance of his own sterility and the medical barriers that had defined his adult life. "We need to be sure," he finally said, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "I'll call the private doctor immediately." Isabella nodded, unable to form words as she observed the gradual transformation in his expression, as if she were witnessing a man confronting the possibility of a miracle he had accepted as impossible. "What if it's true?" she asked softly. "What if we really are?" The Romano family's private doctor's office was a sanctuary of discreet luxury and absolute confidentiality, where family secrets were guarded with the same precision with which medical procedures were performed. Alexander held Isabella's hand throughout the examination, their fingers intertwined in a demonstration of solidarity that transcended any medical or social protocol. The doctor, a middle-aged man who had served the family for decades, maintained a professional expression while conducting the tests, but Isabella could see in his eyes a curiosity that went beyond routine medical interest. "The results will be ready in a few minutes," he said, removing the surgical gloves with precise movements. But based on the described symptoms and preliminary examination, he paused meaningfully. "I would say we have reasons for optimism." When confirmation came, the doctor's words seemed to float in the air like musical notes from an impossible symphony, each syllable carrying the weight of fundamentally changing the reality of everything Alexander had believed about himself. "Congratulations, Mr. Romano," said the doctor with a smile that reflected decades of experience delivering life-changing news. "Mrs. Romano is approximately 2 months pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the sound of two people trying to process a miracle that defied everything medical science had determined as possible. Alexander remained motionless for a long moment, like a marble statue confronting a revelation that completely restructured his understanding of himself. "This is impossible," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The journey back to the mansion passed in a haze of conflicting emotions and discoveries that seemed to alter the very texture of reality around them. Alexander drove in silence for miles, his hands gripping the steering wheel with an intensity that revealed the emotional storm raging within him. When he finally stopped the car on the side of a quiet road, away from curious eyes or indiscreet ears, he turned off the engine and sat trembling with an emotion so intense it seemed to threaten to destroy him from within. "This is impossible," he repeated, turning to Isabella with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. "All the doctors, all the tests, they told me I would never be able to." His voice failed, unable to complete the phrase that had defined his adult life. Isabella reached out and gently touched Alexander's face, her fingers tracing the lines of tension that marked his expression as she tried to offer comfort for a revelation they barely began to understand. "Perhaps love healed what medicine couldn't," she said softly, her voice carrying a wisdom that transcended any scientific explanation. "Perhaps some miracles only happen when we're ready to accept them." Alexander closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, allowing himself for a moment to believe in the possibility that love could really be a healing force capable of overcoming physical limitations that seemed absolute. "Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice vulnerable in a way she had never heard before. "Do you believe this is real?" The return to the mansion was marked by a transformed energy that seemed to electrify the air around them, as if the very architecture of the place recognized the magnitude of the change that had occurred in its principal occupants. Alexander stopped the car at the main entrance and, without saying a word, got out and walked to Isabella's side, opening her door with a ceremony that seemed appropriate for a moment that would redefine their lives. When she stepped out of the vehicle, he took her in his arms with a tenderness that contrasted with his impressive physical strength, carrying her through the front door while whispering words of love in Italian that made her heart melt. "You have given me everything," he said, stopping at the foot of the marble staircase to look deeply into her eyes. "The air I needed, the love I didn't know I wanted, and now," his voice failed again, "a miracle I never thought possible." Alexander carried Isabella up the stairs with a determination that transcended any romantic protocol, each step a declaration of his intentions to protect and honor the miracle she carried within her. When they reached the master bedroom, he gently placed her on the bed and leaned down to kiss her with a passion that combined reverence with desire, as if trying to convey through touch everything that words couldn't adequately express. "You are amazing," he murmured against her lips, his hands trembling slightly as they touched her still flat stomach. "You're carrying my child, our child, something I never thought would be possible." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face as she observed the complete transformation of the man who had begun as a business arrangement and become the love of her life. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much it hurts." The months that followed passed like a feverish dream of preparation and anticipation, with Alexander transforming into the most attentive and protective husband Isabella could have imagined. He accompanied every medical appointment, every exam, every significant moment of the pregnancy, with a dedication that bordered on obsession, but revealed the depth of his gratitude for a miracle that continued to defy his understanding. Matthew, now 3 years old, had accepted the news of a little sibling with the characteristic enthusiasm of childhood, often talking to Isabella's belly, as if the baby could hear and respond. "Daddy is very happy when he talks about the baby," he observed one afternoon, with the surprising insight of children. "He smiles differently now." Isabella laughed, realizing that even a 3-year-old could recognize the transformation that true love had worked in Alexander. The ceremony of official recognition as the most powerful capo di tutti capi of the organization was planned to coincide with Isabella's 8th month of pregnancy, a synchronization that Alexander considered perfectly symbolic of his complete triumph in both love and power. Isabella appeared radiant in the mansion's main hall, her navy blue silk dress specifically designed to accommodate her prominent belly while maintaining the elegance that the position required. The guests, an assembly of the most powerful and feared men of the underworld, observed with a mixture of respect and admiration as she walked alongside Alexander, her presence conferring a humanity and warmth that contrasted with the usual formality of such events. "You look stunning," Alexander whispered as they positioned themselves for the ceremony. "I'm so proud of you, of us, of everything we've built together." The culminating moment of the ceremony arrived when Alexander rose to give his acceptance speech, Matthew enthusiastically running toward him shouting, "Daddy!" with the carefree joy that only children can express. Alexander caught him in his arms without breaking the solemnity of the moment, positioning himself before the assembly with a radiant Isabella by his side and Matthew proudly perched on his arm. "Il capo di tutti capi protects not only territories but families," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with an authority that had been forged through years of struggle and sacrifice. "Mine is complete." He turned to Isabella, his eyes shining with a love that transformed the political speech into a romantic declaration witnessed by hundreds of powerful men. Leaning in to kiss her softly, he whispered in her ear words that only she could hear. "You gave me an empire, but more importantly, you gave me a home." The ovation that echoed through the hall was more than an acknowledgement of political power. It was a celebration of a love story that had transformed a cold business arrangement into the foundation of an empire based not only on fear and respect, but on devotion and family. Isabella felt tears of happiness streaming down her face as she watched Alexander being officially crowned as the supreme leader, knowing they had traveled an impossible journey from that desperate night in the cafe to this moment of complete triumph. The most powerful men in the organization rose in unanimous demonstration of reverence, not just to the new capo di tutti capi, but to the woman who had transformed a lonely emperor into a complete man. Matthew applauded enthusiastically from Alexander's arms, not fully comprehending the magnitude of the moment, but instinctively feeling the importance of the occasion, his innocent smile reflecting the pure joy that had blossomed in that unlikely family. "We did it," thought Isabella, placing a protective hand over her belly where the miracle grew that had cured not only Alexander's sterility, but also the loneliness that had haunted them both for so long, observing how love had rewritten the rules of a world that believed only in power and strength. Against all odds, against all expectations, against all limitations that seemed absolute, we managed to find true love and build something eternal. If Isabella Carter's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like and comment where you're from. And don't go anywhere. The next story is already appearing on screen, made especially for you. See you soon.